Yes, I can hear you clearly now.
Hello, Jim. This is Dr. Akram Habib, the head of the English department. Morning. On behalf of IUG, the English department, we would like to welcome you, Mr. Jim Michin, and thank you for speaking to us today. I have to give a little bit information. Mr. Jim is a communication management consultant, senior policy analyst for Congress, and an award-winning investigative reporter, providing an insider look into the U.S. mainstream media and Congress words. He's with us today to talk about the effective media campaigning addressing U.S. mainstream media. This is a lecture that is of great benefit for our students of English department, the students of journalism at the Islamic University, the students of political science, and the Palestinian activists in general. We hope that you would benefit from this lecture. And again, I want to reiterate my deep thanks for Mr. Jim for giving us this time to make our students benefit. I would like to leave the ground for Dr. Mushir, the moderator of this lecture, and I wish you happy time, audience, Mr. Jim, and the next time we will wish to see you in Gaza. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dr. Akram. Do you hear us, Jim?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Can you hear me?
Oh yes, sure. All right.
All right.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks a lot for coming today to this important lecture that is generously and kindly delivered by Mr. Jim Micchi. Without any delay, I'm going just to give you a brief bio of Mr. Jim Micchi. Mr. Jim Micchi's experience in the nation's capital spans more than 3 decades. As a strategic planner and consultant in congressional media and communication management. He is a public and government affairs executive, and he's a chief investigator and senior public policy analyst for Congress. And he is also an award-winning investigative journalist and reporter. Top-level federal and corporate officials have turned to Jim for his counsel, for his consultation, in preparing for appearances before congressional committees and on such shows such as Dateline, Lehra News Hour, Nightline, 60 Minutes, Larry King Live, and on newscasts on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and MSNBC. As an award-winning investigative reporter in Washington, Jim produced news reports and documentaries on public health and welfare issues, and on environmental and transportation issues. He won an Emmy for a mini-documentary series on hazards in interstate highway travel. Jim has actually been a vocal advocate and activist for the Palestinian cause, and he has been a very outspoken critic of U.S. mainstream media's representation of the conflict, and especially of the New York Times coverage of the Palestinian situation. And therefore, he is going to speak to us today on or about effective media campaigning and effective communication strategies and tools that we can actually employ in order to further the cause of justice and freedom for the Palestinian people, and how we can debunk Israeli propaganda and Israeli PR propaganda machine. So without any delay, I would like to leave the floor for Mr. Jim to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A and some comments from the audience. You are most welcome, Jim, for kindly agreeing to speak to our students here at the Islamic University. And yes, please, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Professor. Good morning, Gaza. Good morning, State of Palestine. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you this morning. I was every bit as dumb and ignorant as most Americans until my wife and I met a young student at your university, Shru Kaila. That was about 6 months ago. And that led us to look into what's really happening in Palestine and in Israel. And it's not a pretty picture, as you know. We're here this morning to talk about how you can effectively communicate, educate the news media, world leaders, and legislators around the world. But we particularly want to focus on America because America needs education. America has been focused most on propaganda from the evil empire. And you know what empire that is, don't you? Of course you do. So we're here to educate Americans and also Europeans because they're fairly ignorant too, and they're also very biased. What we want to do is we want to dispel erroneous, deceptive, and false propaganda. That's what this campaign is all about. Replace false perception with reality, supported by fact and history. Email, social media messages to news media, and that includes the publishers, the editors and reporters, also the world leaders and the legislators. These messages must create ideal perceptions. And those perceptions are that your messages and emails need to be credible, they need to be comprehensible, understandable, convincing, and concise. So let's talk about these people. Who are these people? The news media, the publishers, editors, reporters, world leaders, legislators. The publishers and editors are driven primarily by the bottom line. What I mean by that is profit, money, and what they perceive as reader interests. What do the readers want to read about? The next thing is political interests, requirements of government. Now we all know that some governments are more democratic than others, and so that's extremely important. Laws affecting and regulating free speech and privacy. And we all know what's happened to free speech and privacy in Israel. There is none. None whatsoever. And the people in this country are robbing us of our privacy and also our free speech. And we must put a stop to that. And what's working for us today more than anything else is the internet. The internet. You have freedom there still. And let's hope we can keep it. So let's have a look at news reporters. What about them? Where are they in all of the scheme of things? They're driven by deadlines. You know what a deadline is. They have to submit a story before the newspaper or the network or the news station does its newspaper or its broadcast. They're always in a hurry. Now, how do I know that? Because I used to be one. I was a reporter in broadcast journalism for about 16 years. I worked in New Orleans, Deep South, where I covered the civil rights movement, among other things. And what struck me right away was the number of parallels, so many parallels between the Deep South back in the 1960s when the blacks were treated terribly, ugly culture, segregation, apartheid, all of the ugly things that go with that. And where do we find that also? We find that in Israel, do we not? Israel, there's so many parallels between Israel's system, and put that in quotes, and what the Deep South of the U.S. used to be. Generalists. You can count on most reporters being generalists, okay? They're really not experts on anything. They rely on hearsay, they rely on people that they happen to come in contact with. They're skeptical. Yes, they are. I used to be very skeptical. And you got to watch out for this. They may have hidden agendas. Hidden agendas. Okay? Now, let's take an example. New York Times, the Bureau in Jerusalem. The Bureau in Jerusalem, in my opinion, has a hidden agenda. Why? Because they are lockstep into Israel's program, I should say program, okay? Taking away your land, taking away your lives, bombing you, lying to you, and all the rest of the terrible things that go with apartheid, racism, and fascism. Yes, because that's also fascism. The Bureau in Jerusalem does exactly what it should be doing as far as Israel is concerned, and that is heavy bias toward Israel. Never say anything at all that criticizes Israel. New York Times, you won't read criticism in New York Times about Israel. Why? Because the New York Times is owned by a Jewish family. Now, but at the same time, the former publisher, not the present publisher, his father, Arthur O. Salisbury Sr., made it a practice, it was his principle, never to assign reporters or editors to his Jerusalem bureau who were Jewish. Why? Because he knew that it gave the appearance, at the very least, of conflict of interest. And this is what is going on right now, because not only are all of the reporters and the bureau chief Jewish, but at least one of the reporters there, Isabel Kirshner, her son, is in the Israeli army. My goodness, he's with the Israeli Destruction Force. That's what I call it. Not Israeli Defense Force, Israeli Destruction Force. Because that's what they're dedicated to doing, to destroy Palestine. Okay? So that's why you won't read very much truth in the New York Times. Reporters also may be dishonest and deceptive, and of course that goes hand in hand with what's going on with the New York Times. Moving on to world leaders, presidents, prime ministers. What are they driven by? By political expediency. National and global. National and global, and the national and global economy and balance of power. Balance of power is extremely important. Public voter expectations and requirements. Where there are elections, they do their best to put their best foot forward. Often their feet are made of clay, and obviously that bespeaks of lying and deception. Public voter perception and approval. Oh yes, they depend on that. And sometimes they buy their way into polls to make sure that the right questions are asked. Then we also, with the world leaders and the prime ministers, they also are driven by hidden agendas in many cases. We see that in America, we see it in Israel, we see it in Germany, we see it in a number of other countries. And lastly, too often, world leaders, legislators, prime ministers, presidents are dishonest, deceptive, and corrupt. Corruption in government leads to absolute corruption. And this is what America faces right now. Corruption, all right, as well as dishonesty and deception. Let's review for a minute media public perceptions of Palestine. And this is in the U.S. and in much of Europe. Here are some of the bullets that you often read about in stories and also broadcast. Palestinians are Arab terrorists and want to kill all Jews. Yeah, yo, boy, you hear that all the time. Gaza is a stronghold of Hamas, a terrorist force, and the enemy of Israel. Oh yeah, you hear that all the time. Hamas launches thousands of rockets into Israel, digs terror tunnels into Israel. Hamas uses children and women as human shields. Palestinians threaten Jews in East Jerusalem and West Bank with bombs. Palestinians want an end to occupation to threaten Israel's settlers and settlements. Oh yes. Israel must maintain the occupation in its own defense. In its own defense, my goodness. And defend the settlements. Yes, settlements that are on Palestinian land, settlements that are illegal and unlawful according to international law. Jews have resettled the land. This is what they say. Jews have resettled the land, that means Palestine, given to them by God centuries ago. Oh yeah. And then there never was a Palestine. Did you know that? That's what they say. There never was a Palestine, a nation dreamed up by Arabs to lay claim to land. So in other words, the land was never yours. Now, let's take a look at message development and strategy. We talked about what was needed. Remember, they must be credible, comprehensible, convincing, and concise. What do you do to draft messages and emails? First, you have to research and study the websites of major newspapers and network broadcasters. That's extremely important. That's where you find their email addresses. I'll give you an example. NBC, National Broadcasting System in America. You can send them a message and an email, but oh, do you have to look hard for the clickable where you can put your cursor and click on it to get to the place where you write your message or email. Where do you find that? Way down at the bottom of the home page on the internet of NBC, in very small print, it says, "Contact us." Okay, so you want to click on that, all right, in order to get to a place where you can send them a message, because otherwise, there's no way for you to do so, unless you have the email addresses of reporters and editors. Determine the accuracy and bias of published and broadcast stories and editorials. You know better than anyone else, my dear friends, what is accurate and what is not, and what is biased and what is fair, accurate, and credible. Next, organize your facts to counter inaccurate and biased stories and editorials. You must have the facts to throw back at them. Know what you want to say. And of course, that has to be specific to whatever story you're criticizing or editorial that you're criticizing. Know what you don't want to say. The last thing you want to do is to appear to be, how should I put it? Appear to be off your rocker, or a bit crazy, or intemperate. You want to approach them in a calm manner, with good English, with fact and history to show them where they are going wrong in their stories. Have an agenda. You've got to have an agenda specific to the recipient of your emails and messages, no matter who it is. Whoever you do write, whatever you do write, it must be true. It must be true to you, and it must ring true with your recipient. So that goes to fact and history. Now, we have pretty much covered what I wanted to cover, and I think I've done it in less than 30 minutes. At least I hope I have. Let's see. Yes. I certainly have about 20 minutes. So, Professor, I'm now at your disposal and at the disposal of your students.
All right. Actually, you sent me. Thanks a lot, Jim, for this very informative talk about.
The audio is not good.
All right. So, how about now?
The audio is not good.
Okay. Can you actually hear me now?
So, if the students have questions, or if you have questions,
right,
speak slowly and directly into the mic. Okay.
All right. Jim, can you actually hear me now?
I'm sorry, but your audio is
not working. All right. Jim? Hello, Jim?
I can hear you a little better.
Okay, a little better. Okay. Thanks a lot for this informative talk, and you've actually sent me emails, like sample emails for things that we can actually send to the New York Times publisher, for instance, and to President Obama. What are sort of the key things that you would like to emphasize in these kinds of emails?
I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
Okay, well, what are the things that you would like to always to emphasize in emails sent to the New York Times publishers or reporters or to President Obama or to Congress? What things should students focus on?
I understand now. This is a process of letting them know that whatever they're printing is missing either fact or history. So many things that are reported, especially by the New York Times, the Washington Post, are out of context. Now, if you read the example of my email example to the New York Times publisher, you notice that I said in there that it was out of context. Why? Because he didn't mention anything about why there is, as the editorial said, unrest, okay, in Palestine. Of course there's unrest. My goodness, when you go around massacring over 2,000 people, 500 or more of them children, when you destroy homes, when you steal property, when you destroy businesses, when you steal land that belongs to somebody else, this has to be stated in an editorial like that. If there's unrest, then why? But they don't give you the why. And that's why you have to go back to them, as I said, as I did in my email to Mr. Salzberger, and you have a copy of it there. I made it clear to him that he was missing not only fact, but also history. And at the end, I asked the question, my question to you, your editors and reporters, when will you end your heavy bias toward favoring Israel and its forced and all too often brutal occupation of Palestine?
So it boils down to a
They never speak of Palestine. You won't see the word occupation in that editorial.
So usually,
you will not find it.
Yeah. So reporting is usually decontextualized. So it's
Okay,
lack of context.
Your audio is bad.
All right, thanks a lot. So my comment is that it's usually decontextualized, so there is a lack of context for covering the news of Palestine.
Oh, okay, so repeat whatever question there is.
Okay, all right. I'm going to open the floor for our students to ask you questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please come forward, or I can actually relate the question to Jim. Any questions? All right. Jim, the question is, are you optimistic about any chance for changing U.S. position on the situation in Palestine? We've seen a good improvement in the European position with the recent recognition of Palestine in a number of European parliaments. But what about your thoughts on the U.S. positions? We know that the U.S. has a very long-standing position that supports the Israeli occupation state. So are you optimistic about any chance for changing the U.S. position?
Yes, there's always a chance to change the U.S. position, which unfortunately has been a position just loaded with bias toward Israel. And you know, I'm a person who believes that there is an evil empire in the world today, and it includes America and Israel. They are partners in the evil empire, and the way we're going to change U.S. policy, you know, as far as Israel is concerned, social media message campaign. And the reason why that's so important is because Israel right now and for years has been paying people, paying them money to do such a campaign, not only from within the U.S. and Israel, but from around the world. And so what happens is when they see an article or a broadcast that's unfavorable to Israel, they blitz the media. They send many emails telling them how wrong they are and what the truth is, and put the word truth in quotes because it's all lies. Okay, we all know that. Unfortunately, my belief is that Israel has borrowed the playbook, public affairs propaganda playbook of Joseph Goebbels, propaganda, the minister of Adolf. Often enough, people will come to believe it. So you've got to have this campaign in order to counteract the campaign that Israel has right now in place, sending emails to the New York Times, to NBC, to CBS, to the Washington Post, to the LA Times, to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, to the Chicago Tribune, and I could go on and on and on. So that's what is needed, a counter campaign to refute the many lies that are being told by the evil empire.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Another question is, you recently told me about a joint prayer, Muslim prayer at a church in Washington D.C. So I think this is.
I'm sorry. Get a little closer to the mic.
Okay, all right, okay. You actually told me about a prayer, a Muslim prayer in a church in DC. So, and you've been active in advocating BDS boycott of Israel and imposing sanctions on Israel, and you sent letters to the pastor over there. So can you just tell our students here about this experience and your thoughts about it?
Well, as you know, as you all know, BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, was born in Palestine. That's where it started. Back in 2005, I think that's when it started, and it has begun to grow by leaps and bounds. In the U.S., there are campaigns on university campuses like yours, where students are campaigning on their universities to stop investing their funds in companies that support the infrastructure of Israel's forced military occupation of Palestine. The religious denominations, they also are coming forward. The Presbyterians, as you may have heard, in America has passed a resolution for divestment and boycott. California Diocese of the Episcopal Church has passed a boycott divestment resolution. And right now, in my diocese of the Episcopal Church, I just introduced and submitted a resolution calling for divestment and boycott of investments, church investments in companies that support the infrastructure of the occupation, and also boycott of all Israeli products that come here that are imported here. So hopefully that will pass at a convention that will be happening this coming summer. So it's growing. It is growing. And it's very effective because Israel has begun to complain about it. Israel has gone to the lengths of paying individuals to go into these universities and try to intimidate and to lie and give false stories about what's really happening in Israel and Palestine. So once again, the playbook of Joseph Goebbels is also being used here in America. Yes.
Yes.
So it's not a pretty picture.
Okay. Well said. All right, Abdurrahim. Yes. He's not going to be able to hear you. So just tell me the question and I'll relay it.
How did you reach the truth about us despite the manipulative media that divides your country? How did you know that we are right and the Israelis are not?
Okay. This is actually a question I've all thought about as well. Thanks, Abdurrahim. It's about, it's rather a personal question. How did you come to support the Palestinian?
I can't understand you. Your microphone is very directional.
Right.
You know, so try and speak directly into it.
Sure. This is a rather personal question, Jim. How did you come to support the Palestinian rights for freedom and justice, realizing that, you know, the mainstream media milieu in the U.S. is rather one which is favorable to Israel, which is biased to Israel?
Talk very slowly. Talk very slowly. And don't move your head. Look, don't move your head. Talk slowly, right?
All right. Okay. Sorry. لا مالوش دخل المايك كده. All right. Okay, Jim. How about now? Okay, sounds good. Sure. Hold on a sec, please. It's all technical stuff. All right. My question to you is a rather personal question. How did you come to support the Palestinian cause for justice and freedom, realizing that the political landscape and mainstream media landscape in the U.S. is one that is favorable to Israel, that sidelines with Israel at the expense of Palestinian rights? So it's more of a personal story that you can tell us about it.
About 6 months, and my Gideon met on Facebook and Twitter, and from there we also found other people. And now we have about 30 or 40 Facebook friends from Gaza. Now we're looking for friends in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. But anyway, as a reporter, I started looking into what's going on, you know, as far as Israel is concerned and its treatment. And so I used Google. That was my tool, Google. And that's what led me to understand and appreciate that Palestine is under a brutal forced military occupation. And then, of course, when the, I call it blitzkrieg, was leveled on Gaza beginning in July and continued for 51 days, then Shuk would almost daily give us reports on what was happening. And that's how I met other people as well in Gaza. And it just, you know, if you take the time to do the research and know the history. Before 6 months ago, I had never heard of Nakba. Never.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, isn't that pathetic? Yes, it is pathetic.
It is.
But that's where most Americans are. They know nothing about what's going on there and what's been going on. They know nothing about the 47-year occupation. They know nothing about the fact that Gaza has been attacked and brutally bombed and shelled 3 times in the last 6 years. They know nothing about that, okay? Now, that's why it's so important, okay, to reach out to the news media. And also, I cannot emphasize too strongly emails to President Obama to tell him, to plead with him, do not veto a resolution that ends occupation of Palestine, because he right now is wanting to do what Israel wants him to do.
True.
Okay? So it's extremely important that you not only reach out to media, and the number 1 is New York Times, number 2 is the Washington Post, okay? Those 2 you want to concentrate on, because the rest of the media, including broadcast, they usually read the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that becomes their newscast.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a question actually of ignorance amongst the American public at large of what is going on in Palestine. So we need actually to reach out to American audiences, whether in the mainstream media or in the Congress or people at large, you know, ordinary people living and not knowing much about Palestine, and what they get is actually misinformed and distorted ideas about the occupation, about Israel and the Palestinians.
I'm not sure I understood what you said, but the American public, unfortunately, relies on newspapers and on broadcast media for their news. And over the past 25 or 30 years, since I was in that line of work, journalism in the U.S. has tanked. It has tanked because they no longer have bureaus. There is no NBC bureau in Israel or Palestine. Whenever they want to do a story, it's always a story about what Israel thinks and says, okay? It's never about Palestine. And so what they do is they send in a contractor, okay? Somebody that's working for Sky News or BBC, and we all know how biased BBC is, don't we? BBC is terrible. And you know, sometimes I'm shocked to see stories in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, criticizing the government.
Doing a much better coverage than.
But you will never see that in American newspapers, never.
All right, another question. Yes, Shayman, please. Well, you can just relay the question to me.
We know that the European governments and the U.S. government have like great relations with so-called Israel, and we now see that there is a rising public opinion among the European and the American people supporting Palestine. You know, especially following the last assault in Gaza. So, do you think that this new rising public opinion can actually affect the governments to you know, change the nature of their relationship with Israel, maybe to put some pressure to affect their economy, or the mutual benefits actually govern the acts of the performance of the governments, and they will keep their relationship with Israel?
Okay, European governments.
European and the US government.
Okay, in the US government. All right, there is a question about what do you think about, of course, the context is there is an increasing support for the Palestinian cause in Europe, especially with public opinion, and which is clearly seen in Europe. So, do you think that with more and more public support from international public opinion, that would pressure or put pressure on European governments and US governments to change course and pressure Israel into giving or accepting Palestinian rights?
If you're asking me about Europe, the European countries, Sweden was the first to recognize Palestine as a state, a nation state. And now we have votes from Ireland, Great Britain, and of course we know what Great Britain did, not for, but to Palestine. They created the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that unilaterally, without consulting anyone, not even the British people, they decided to give Palestine to the Jews, or to the Zionists. I want to make a distinction because there's a difference between Zionism and Judaism, okay? The Zionists who first migrated to Palestine back in right after World War II were not even Jews. They were atheists.
Correct.
They were atheists. That's what they were. And they went in there, as you all know, and destroyed whole villages, massacred whole villages, took whatever they wanted. There's a philosophy in Zionism, and the philosophy is this, and this is what is governing Israel today. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine for the taking. That's a philosophy.
Yes.
Okay? And the Zionists who are ruling Israel right now are oppressing the Jews who also live there, and make them and intimidate them and make them fearful of reprisal if they demonstrate against Zionist rule of Palestine. And as you know, there have been demonstrations in Tel Aviv by Israeli Jews who support the rights of Palestinians. Okay, and what happened? Netanyahu, in my opinion, he's a sociopathic megalomaniac. What did he do? He created a law saying that there could be no more demonstrations, if you recall. Not only that, but he recently established a law that forbids Israeli non-Jews, Israeli Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, from doing any comments on Facebook that criticize Israel in any way, because it's going to incite riot and whatever. So they're also taking away freedom of speech completely. Okay. So, but in Europe there is a movement, and it's taking hold, and Israel is fighting it tooth and nail, and they're using President Obama and our government to counter that, to try and destroy that movement toward giving Palestine its human and civil rights. This is what's going on. But even so, for example, Switzerland recently had a conference on this particular subject, and who boycotted the conference? U.S. and Israel. They were the only two that didn't go to that conference. Okay, so Israel and U.S. are joined at the hip. You know what I mean?
Yep.
They're joined at the hip, and that has to be severed. Okay, and the only way you can do that is to change public opinion in the U.S., but also in Europe as well, but primarily in the U.S., because unless and until that happens, the U.S. will continue to veto anything at all that benefits Palestine, because Israel is opposed to it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jim. Actually, the idea is that we have to work hard to get to that critical mass in the U.S.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
All right. Okay. Another question? Okay. Yes, sure.
Just speak. Well, look, speak directly into the mic.
Sure.
And don't move your head.
All right. Thanks a lot. Okay. Okay, just a second. Question. Say it again, please.
Hamas was ruled out of the European courts as a terrorist organization and recognized as a resistance organization. What effect do you think this will have on the Palestinian case in the future?
On the Palestinian case. Now, we've heard about the European Court's decision to overrule the decision to consider Hamas a terrorist organization. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sure.
As you know, the EU has removed Hamas from its terrorist list.
How do you see?
Yes.
Sure. My
and
question.
Of course, what did Netanyahu do? Well, I can imagine he started throwing his furniture against the walls. Okay, because you know he is extremely traumatic when it comes to things that happen that he doesn't like. All right, and who else was like that? I can name one person who was like that. His name was Adolf Hitler. That's who he was. Okay.
So how do you see the effects of the impact of this decision on the U.S. particularly and on the Palestinian cause at large?
Say it again and slowly.
Okay. How do you see the effect of this decision, of this European Court's decision, on the U.S. in particular, and as well as on the Palestinian people?
There are many, I'm not sure I understand your question, but there are many Palestinian refugees who live in the U.S., okay? And also Lebanese refugees. And of course there is a kinship between Lebanon and Palestine. There always has been. At least that's my understanding.
Sure. There is.
And you know, and of course Israel recognizes that, and that's why they attacked Lebanon. You know, so but a dear friend of ours, Helen Thomas.
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard of Helen Thomas.
Sure. Yes, I did.
We met her through her niece, with whom I worked on Capitol Hill when I was in the Congress, and I came to appreciate what Helen Thomas told that rabbi one day outside of her office when he asked her, well, what do you want the Israelis to do? And she just looked at him and laughed and said, get the hell out of Palestine. Remember? And what happened? The American media and the political, terrible political machine crushed her, okay, and denied her a job and all the rest of it. But we know now, I know now, what she was talking about. She was talking about the occupation. That's what she was talking about. The occupation that has stolen so much and, you know, chopped up the West Bank. The West Bank, 101 fixed checkpoints and border crossings. More than 300 physical obstructions blocking Palestinian access to main traffic arteries, for example. Forbidden 65 kilometers of road to travel by Palestinians. A 25-foot high concrete separation, they call it separation. I call it apartheid barrier, okay, that snakes throughout the West Bank. These are things that you never read about, not only in the U.S. media, but also in the European media. And that's why it's so important, and I'm going to emphasize this over and over, that if you folks can put together a campaign, and the way I would do it is I would segment it. I would segment it into teams. Have one team do emails to President Obama. He's got to receive those emails. Have another team focus on the media, and the media that should be focused on, and I'll give you the newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, that's the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, Miami Herald, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, okay? Those half dozen or so newspapers need to be blitzed. I'll use the German term, blitzed. In other words, deluged with as many emails as possible based on what they print, and also based on stories that they ought to be printing. There's so many stories that appear on the internet, on websites from the Middle East that tell horrific stories about what's going on in Palestine and Israel. Those stories could be emailed, messaged with the link or the URL to newspapers, and just simply ask, this is a story we think you ought to be interested in, you know, that sort of thing. That doesn't take a lot of time.
Sure.
So separate them in teams. Another team could focus on the U.S. Congress, and then a fourth team could focus on European media. Now that's a lot to put on anybody's plate. That's why I'm saying teams should be organized to go into these specific areas.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jim. Another question?
Can I ask him, since people like this is an institutionalized, you know, I mean, the New York, you know, you cannot crack them down from the inside because they would, you know, ignore and discard whatever email you send them. So we need a more effective way from the outside, like to counteract what they publish. So I don't think, you know, if you send the chief editor of the Washington Post, they would throw it in the dustbin. So, like, we need like something from the outside. What does he suggest?
From the outside?
The outside,
you mean like us?
Yeah, no, from the outside.
From
this newspaper to scandalize them, to discredit them.
From the mean American public?
No, yes, no, we need like to send our message. If we send like to the Washington Post and the New York, they would ignore it, you know? But we need like a more effective way to show that whatever they publish is wrong and biased. So
it's rather a comment on the idea that the...
I can't hear you.
All right. So it's rather a comment on the idea that the U.S.
Raise your head just a little bit.
Okay. How about now? Sure.
That's better.
Okay. So it's rather a comment on the idea that the U.S. press, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, have actually placed thick walls that cannot really actually be penetrated by the idea of sending emails from the outside world, from Palestine. So we need more effective or equally effective mechanism to actually influence these news media, other than or in addition to emailing from Palestinians or email campaigns in general. Is there any other way we can influence, like the New York Times editors or the Washington Post publisher, to actually change their position on the Palestinian cause, in addition to media campaigns or email?
I do wish that Gaza had a postal service. You don't, so you can't mail letters. You know, and that's why I am suggesting that you focus your attention on emails and social media messages.
Yep.
Even just a Twitter. A tweet on Twitter with a URL, a link to a story that appeared in one of the websites in the Middle East that tells a story that is not in the American media or is not in the European media. All of these people have Twitter addresses. You can send tweets to Benjamin Netanyahu if you want to. Yeah, he's got an address on, and I send them to him, and I tell him how crazy he is. You know? Yeah, because he is crazy. and I also send tweets to Isabel Kirshner, who does not have an email address.
Yeah.
And finding her about her conflict of interest. How can you write an objective, factual story when your own son is serving in the Israeli destruction force? How can you do that? It's impossible.
It's impossible,
Okay?
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Again, the other subjects that could be addressed in emails.
Yeah.
The blockade, the siege, the isolation of Gaza.
Yeah.
1.8 billion people from the rest of the world. People in Gaza can't even visit their friends and relatives in East Jerusalem or the West Bank. They can't go there. Gaza, for all practical purposes, is a carbon copy, a very large carbon copy of German concentration camps.
It's
That's
true.
what it is.
It is true.
It's a concentration camp. You are encircled by the military, and even if you dare to approach their no man's land, you know, that piece of land that they've taken and decided no one can go there, if someone even goes there by mistake, what do? They shoot and kill them. You know?
It actually happens quite.
This is something. Go ahead.
Yeah, it actually happens quite frequently, just a few kilometers away from where we are now. All right, I've got another question. Baha, please.
Why is Northern America affected by the Israeli propaganda while the Southern America is not affected that much?
Say it again, please. يا بهاء ما سمعتش كويس.
Why is Northern America affected by the Israeli propaganda while the Southern America is not affected in that much?
Okay, so the question is about U.S. position on the Israel, and in a stark sort of difference to Latin America's position on Palestine and Israel. So there is a comparison here in the political positions taken by the two regions. So the question is, why is that?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons I can think of right now is that we used to consider Central and South America as our backyard. You know, it was ours. Okay, well, it's not. And countries in South and Central America have begun to realize that. For example, Venezuela has recognized Palestine, I think. Bolivia has declared Israel a terrorist state. Did you know that?
True, yes.
Yeah. So these are examples of South and Central American countries throwing off the yoke, and it's an economic yoke, of the U.S., of the United States. They are sick and tired of our, I call it a corporatist oligarchy, ruling and having control over their countries through bribery, through intelligence, through force, you know, and so on. Central and South America are rebelling, and that's good news. In fact, look at Russia, for example. Russia recently announced, because of the U.S. destroying the democratic government of Ukraine, Russia is now flying missions of their jet bombers into the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, my goodness. The people at the Pentagon started throwing their furniture against the wall, okay? I mean, they couldn't understand how this could happen. And here's what Obama is trying to counter that with. He all of a sudden, 2 days ago, decided, oh, we have to recognize Cuba. We have to reinstate diplomatic relations with Cuba, you know, which should have been done 50 years ago.
That's correct,
Just as Israel should have given Palestine its independence 47 years ago and didn't.
Okay, we've got one last question. We've got... Okay, yes, yes, please.
What do you think of the political divisions within the Palestinian community and how that affects the Palestinian case and the people of Palestine.
Okay. So the question is in the Palestinian internal division, you know, the that you're familiar with. How do you think this impacts support or international support for the Palestinians in general?
Okay, I think I heard you. This is an important point. There needs to be a concentration of convincing the television stations that are live streamed on the internet, along with the newspapers that are published in Palestine. They need to, on the internet, post English translations. There needs to be an English broadcast, okay, from Palestine. There is none right now that I know of.
Yeah.
And so there needs to be at least 2 daily newscasts from Palestine. Why? Because the Israelis have been flooding the U.S. Live stream television, Channel 2, out of, I don't know where it is, Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Channel 2, I can get that on my computer. And what are they broadcasting? Propaganda.
Yeah.
And what is this propaganda all about? Oppressing the Palestinians. That's what it's all about.
All right. Okay. Well, I would like to thank you, Jim, for this very informative talk. It's been very...
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay. So I would like to conclude the lecture by thanking you very much for this very informative talk, and I'm sure
that... I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
All right.
Just lift your head a little bit.
Okay. All right. I would like to thank you for this very informative talk. It's actually quite educating to a lot of people here, and we very much appreciate you waking up early, very early in the morning, to talk to us, and this is very kind of you. And we hope that we'll have other occasions to get to hear you in the future, hopefully.
I would hope so, because I am always thinking of ways to get the message out. I send many emails to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to the networks here, correcting their propaganda that they receive from Israel. I think we managed to, hello, Gaza. Look at all of you, you're beautiful people. Beautiful people, all of you. And I thank you so much for being here. And I want to be able to talk to you some more whenever you're able to, whenever the professor is able to get you all together, because there's so much to talk about. And there are many other questions to ask and also to respond to. I am so excited about this opportunity, because this can be the start of a wonderful campaign to educate the American people as well as the people in Europe, but primarily American, because we have been deluged with Israeli propaganda, deluged, and most of it is pure, unadulterated lies over and over and over again. And hopefully Mr. Sulzberger maybe will understand and appreciate why his father had decided when he was publisher back in the 60s and earlier not to send Jews to his bureau, because that is a conflict of interest. And hopefully that'll happen. And also hopefully, what's her name? Isabel Kirshner. She's a contractor, by the way. She's not employed by the New York Times. And so that's the excuse they're giving for her to be able to have her son in the Israeli destruction force. We have so much to do and we have so much to talk about, but my advice is do it in increments. Do it in increments, and also please try and get your colleagues, your friends, your relatives in East Jerusalem and the West Bank to do the same thing. Maybe what we could do is organize these types of discussions with universities in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. I don't know, because I don't know if there's a way for you to transmit these Skypes to the other two territories. If there is, that would be terrific. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves. Please, all of you, be safe. Inshallah. Salam.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Talk to you soon, later. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.